Best of R/Malicious Compliance Episode 53. As you may know, hunting and fishing is very big in Alaska. I don't hunt and am a very occasional, as in a few times only, fisher. What's important to me and a very large portion of the hunting community is conservation efforts. I've always believed in consume what you take and strictly adhere to conservation policies, limits, species, etc. Alaskan outdoorsmen are very knowledgeable of these rules and regulations, and with good reason. The Fish and Wildlife Service is always watching and is very quick to levy huge fines and even imprisonment for outdoorsmen not following the strict policies. Outdoorsmen are also highly encouraged to report offending personnel in order to assist with compliance efforts. This story takes place about 15 years ago, so all people here have likely moved or retired. We had built a new center in Alaska for the Army. In the old center there was a very large and imposing taxiderm display polar swiping at a seal. When I say large, I mean a polar bear that was at least 12 feet long. He was on all fours, in a display that was about 16 feet x 8 feet x 6 feet. It was a massive display of a polar bear that was taken prior to the ban in 1972, Marine Mammal Protection Act. The Army wanted this display in the new center, but since it was so large we had to leave it in the old center until the very last days. I did routine inspections of the new center at least twice a year where I would meet up with the head civilian. I loved my trips to Alaska because it was such a beautiful place. It should be noted that at the time my big boss was at the Pentagon and his last name was very unique. Let's just call him Colonel Poliber. On one particular inspection, about 3 years after the new center had been built, I noted that some new policy was coming down from Colonel Poliber's office that would affect all of our installations. The civilian kind of grumbled and smirked, then said okay. I could sense that he was irritated, but I didn't know why. I found out later why from one of the motor pool technicians. The civilians here were guard/reservists who wore a uniform one weekend a month, and also were Alaskan residents who had been in the state for many years. The uniformed personnel in charge of the facility and units were active duty and consisted of personnel from all around the country. The motor pool tech told me that prior to Colonel Poliber getting his lofty position, he was the active duty commander of the units here. He was not from Alaska and he was not liked at all. He was racist, sexist, and constantly berated all those lower ranking than him. In one particular instance, he yelled at a female non-commissioned officer who was having trouble doing push-ups. He shouted, "You know why you can't do them? It's because your tits are too effing big," in front of all the soldiers. So Colonel Poliber was actually the commander at the time when we were finished building and were transitioning to our new center. The old center had been earmarked for demolition, which could not proceed until the final piece was removed. That's right, the aforementioned polar bear display. Unfortunately we had no place to put it due to the size. Well, thankfully Colonel Poliber offered up his big house close by where he could store it in the interim. He had the civilian workers carefully move it to an army truck and then carefully roll it into his house. Well, there was just one issue. Not only could you not hunt or shoot a polar bear in Alaska since the very early 70s, you cannot display them in a private residence without a license. Colonel Poliber, not being from Alaska, apparently did not know this rule. After the truck and workers left the house, Fish and Wildlife officers arrived within hours to arrest Colonel Poliber. They placed him in handcuffs and walked him out of his house in view of all. This was thanks to an anonymous call. After all, Alaskan outdoorsmen have to follow the rules. After Colonel Poliber was released, he promptly called a mandatory meeting for all active and guard/reserve personnel to attend in formation and in uniform. As everyone stood at attention, red-faced Colonel Poliber yelled that he wanted to know immediately who had reported him to Fish and Wildlife. As the motor pool tech told me, you could hear a pin drop. This went on for about 10 minutes until everyone was excused. Eventually the polar bear display was placed in the large entrance to the new center. Unfortunately I can't find any pictures of it online. I never did find out who was the one that called Fish and Wildlife. Thank you. Next. Back before cell phone robocalls was the era of fax machine spammers. My office would receive several faxes a day from an office supply business. Phone calls requesting them to stop did nothing. Aside from the waste of paper and ink, these spam faxes came during the busiest part of our day, when our customers faxed in their delivery expectations for the next business day. Each of their faxes had their business header at the top followed by fill out completely, then supplies to choose from, and a number to fax the form back. I told my secretary to take a black marker, circle fill out completely, color in the rest of the page, and fax back 5 times each time we received their order form. The faxes stopped that week. Thank you. Next. I work for a passenger boat company. We have 3 tasks while on board. Secure the boats for embarking and disembarking. Keep an eye out for safety and order, and check tickets and issue fines. A few years ago, the company asked some of the senior staff to temporarily switch to ticket inspector for high season, with the promise to move permanently within a year. Inspectors get a higher pay, and they only do one task, which is checking tickets and issue fines, a thing that we are already required to do. So many of us say yes, gladly. At the end of the season, our reps contact us and say that we have performed well, so the company is having an examination for our promotion. We say we were assured we would be promoted no matter what. Meanwhile, there's a batch of recent hires who have personal ties with the union and the higher-ups. They aren't very happy with their working conditions. It's a rather tough job, especially in the winter or in bad weather, and they often find ways to be dispensed from service, or apply for desk jobs and easily obtain them, even if unnecessary or redundant. Now, we don't have much choice, so we agree to the exam, and surprise surprise, pretty much nobody makes the cut. They had to promote 2 because they knew they got perfect score, despite the exam being for a job that some of us have been doing for decades. At this point, the company has no choice but to look for qualified people among the more recent hires. And wouldn't you know, pretty much all of those who belong to that category immediately pass. Now, the key detail. After we were failed, we were notified with a letter, saying we were unfit for the duties of ticket inspector. The malicious compliance. We took those words to the letter, and we stopped performing the tasks of ticket inspectors, which had been part of our job for years. Either we are fit for a job, or we are unfit. We brought our letter with us, and the first few times supervisors tried to write us up for failing to check the tickets, we promptly produced our very much official dispensation. Not only this decreased our workload immensely, letting us breeze through even the tougher shifts with ease, and generally turning our job into a quite pleasant one, but it cost the company a pretty buck in terms of lost revenue, the fines we don't issue, the greater pay gap they had to fill by using juniors instead of seniors, and the rehiring and retraining of those who still drop out of that job, because it's still outdoor work, and some of the people who they hired just weren't suited for it. Now the supervisors don't even bother with us anymore, and I have that rejection letter in a box with other dear memories like my old D&D character sheets. Edit, I forgot the cherry on top. A couple of months later, their timetable was modified, having them take service at 5 AM twice a week. There's no way I could have kept that up. I worked late shifts for most my career. Dodge that bullet. Thank you. Next. Not as grand as your usual malicious compliance stories, but I still think about it every now and then as it makes me feel smug inside. This happened about a year or 2 ago when I was still studying engineering. Decided physics was more my style. I used to work in retail earning money on the side during my studies. It was a pop-up place in the middle of a mall, where we sold expensive premium alcohols and vodkas, with custom-shaped bottles. It was a fancy establishment. It was fun to work at as we could put our own designs on bottles to make them look arty. One of the things we also allowed was tastes, up to around 3 or 4 samples. This becomes quite important. Usually customers would say what they wanted to taste because of course. One day a group of teens who acted and looked more like pre-teens came up to us making all the witty remarks that lacked wit that only kids could come up with. They asked to have a sample but none were either legal or had it. Continuing to try and get me to make them a quick sample. When I wouldn't budge they left and grabbed a friend who was legal, with his friend snickering. I informed the kid he can have a sample and says I'll take anything. Cue malicious compliance. I grab a sample cup and escort them to the side that had the liquors. We had coconut rum liquor, absinthe and such, but we had one particular liquor that was designed for cocktails. Curacao. It was a deep blue almost sapphire color. Looked beautiful in bottles. I poured the kid a nice sized sample of it. Now anyone who has tasted Curacao can tell you how aggressive and bitter and citrusy the flavor is. This kid shoots it back and recoils at the sudden taste, and pretty sure his friends finally catch a whiff of the smell. He hands the sample glass back to me and they walk away quietly. And if I'm honest, moments like these are why I miss retail. Thank you. Next. There was a year where I was working at a phone company corporate store, and well, I sold phones etc. for a shady phone company. As a result of my many years of servitude selling phones, I personally detest most phone companies, so I was very understanding when people came in angry over one thing or another. Usually, one day I have an older customer come into the store, angrier than most. The company I worked for had been screwing him for years. He was on an old expensive plan. He could have been on a cheaper one the whole time, had an extra line, etc. Long story short, if he, or anyone who's previously worked with him did their due diligence and fixed his account, he'd have been spending $60/more instead of $200. Now, normally when that kind of thing happened, I explain how sorry I am that it happened, and that they can call a number, explain the situation, and sometimes they'll get their money back. And, in my defense, I started to explain that, when instead, I was interrupted with, "No. You've been screwing me for long enough. You're all con artists and charlatans. I want you to cancel my account now. I'm going to competitor." I tried to explain, "Okay, that's understandable, sir, but you don't want me to just cancel your account. If I do that before you move your phone number, you'll lose the number." Quick question. Do you think he listened to that little speech? Nope. Damn IT son. I don't give a about your own commission. Close my account. I try again, "Sir, that's not really a good idea. What you shall." Cursing. So much cursing. Well, alright sir, I tried to warn you. I cancelled his account, just as requested. Guess who rolls in the next day? Company says I need to get information to move my phone number to them, and don't try to convince me to stay. Ha 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 ha, yeah, I'm sorry, sir. Here's the info, but it's not going to work. Excuse you? You told me to cancel your account? Your number's gone. Bull. He leaves with the info. I had the next day off, but I called a work friend. He apparently spent 2 hours yelling at my manager about his now dead/defunct phone number he had for the previous 15 years. Thank you. Next. A couple of friends of mine told me that I really should tell this story here. It's pretty old, but screw it. This happened the summer of 2018. I had a summer job doing graveyard maintenance. So mowing the grass, cleaning gravestones, planting and watering flowers, and clipping hedges. We use a motorized hedge saw for efficiency and speed. P.S. I got the job since my parents know the boss. Since they also work for her. This particular day it was a blistering 32°C in the sunlight. I'm warm-blooded, so I was suffering more than my on-site manager. I went through probably 4 liters of water in 3 hours and I was still feeling nauseous. I asked my manager if I could take an extra break because of the heat. He denied and told me to go clip the hedges. I tried explaining to him that I am warm-blooded and that in 32°C I could not work efficiently thanks to this. He didn't care and just handed me the equipment. This included a shoulder cross strap, a helmet with earmuffs, steel-tipped boots and the 8-kilogram machine. I was feeling that I wasn't going to last long in the sunlight. I was already dehydrated and was pushing myself too much. So I asked him if it couldn't wait until a less sunny day. He ignored me and told me to get to work. I just replied with a LOL. Okay. I worked for probably a solid half hour before I blacked out. I woke up in an ambulance around an hour later, with my boss sitting next to me checking if I was alright. She told me that I had been found by a stranger between a couple of gravestones out cold, with a revving machine in my hands. I was in such bad shape that I was rushed to the hospital and put on intensive care. I couldn't move and had severe dehydration, so I was put on drips for 2 days in order for me to recover. I recovered slowly and was moved to cleaning duty inside. My manager was fired for endangering me and not heeding what I said. Thank you. Next. This happened a few years ago. I just photographed a home for an agent I'd worked with a couple of times before and who'd always jokingly, I thought, complained about what I charged. At the time I was actually cheaper than most other photographers around here, mainly due to relocation and not knowing this market as well. So I tell her what to write the check for and she says, "That's too much," and writes me a check for 50% of what I just told her. I said that wasn't enough and she said, "That's what other photographer would charge," and I knew that was patently false. So I went home and processed the pictures. And in the middle of every picture I put a black box that covered exactly 50% of the picture. Then I sent them to her. "What's wrong with these pictures? You paid 50%. You get 50%. She PayPal'd me the other 50%. Haven't heard from her since. Weird.